Hi, I'm Jeremy Allison with Google's Open Source Program Office, and I'm here with Peter Brown, Executive Director of the Free Software Foundation. Welcome, Peter.
Welcome, Jeremy. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. So, before Linux, before open source, there was free software and the Free Software Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Well, first there was the GNU project. Richard Stallman, the FSF president and founder of the free software movement, in 1983 made an initial announcement about a plan to create a Unix system, Unix-like system, called GNU, which is GNU is not Unix. And in 1985, he created the Free Software Foundation to be a home for the GNU project and to advance the campaigns for software freedom.
So, the GNU project is famously the initiator of the GNU General Public License. So which came first, the project or the license?
The project came first. The first license, in fact, I think was the Emacs license. So the concepts of GNU and free software really took about 2 or 3 years to develop. And so certain changes were made to make sure that Richard was being clear about what the purpose of the philosophy of GNU was. Also in 1985 he released something called the GNU Manifesto, which solidified more of the ideas about the original announcement. And in fact the GNU Manifesto and the Free Software Foundation in fact have just recently passed the 25th anniversary, so we've now been around for 25 years advocating for the use and promote and development of free software. So,
isn't the GNU Manifesto the one that mentions asteroid mining?
It does. It's so interesting.
I remember that one. That
Yes.
was the one that really turned me on to free software, because I remember reading asteroid mining. I could go for that.
Yeah, it's so funny. We're just about to publish the second edition of Richard Stallman's collected essays, Free Software, Free Society, and I was reading an advanced copy of that. And sure enough, I came across again the GNU Manifesto, which I read obviously many years ago because I've been with the Free Software Foundation for 10 years. But it's the first time I've read it in a long while. And he mentions this idea about what free software, what's the purpose of free software. And it's a very idealistic document, the GNU Manifesto. And he talks about how free software is an example of a post-scarcity world.
Yes.
Where we won't have to do very much work. Because society will have developed far enough that work to have food and accommodation will easily be satisfied, and we will spend most of our time, 90% of our time, doing fun things like programming.
Yes.
And not have to do programming for a living, but do fun things like programming or asteroid mining.
Or as I like to say, tea Earl Grey hot.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, but Richard is also a big fan of Earl Grey, so that's funny. So the GNU Manifesto is a very idealistic document. And interestingly enough, I was talking to Richard just 2 days ago about the GNU Manifesto, and he was just expressing a disappointment about how the idealistic nature of that statement in 1985 still seems so far away, not for free software, but generally for society. Whilst free software is certainly a great example of a post-scarcity world, we haven't really progressed as a society towards that in any meaningful way. Certainly in the software arena we have, that we now don't have to continually work to create software tools because we have a body of free software tools, and we can incrementally create new tools, but generally we have the tools necessary to create software for ourselves because of free software.
Yeah, we really haven't got to the asteroid mining yet, which is a shame. But hopefully we'll get there in my lifetime. So one of the things I'd like to ask you about is the difference between open source and free software.
Yeah.
Many of our viewers will be familiar with the term open source, possibly not so familiar with the term free software, although I hope quite a few of them are. So could you explain very clearly what's the difference, why is it important?
So open source talks about the development model of software. It promotes the idea that collaboration and access to the source code is a better method of developing software, as opposed to the free software movement, which cares about freedom. So free software is really a freedom movement in the area of software. So in the same way that we care about free speech, free software is a way of advancing freedom in society, looking at software, looking at the technology we use. So if we talk about freedom as opposed to the method of creating software, if we talk about the reasons for creating software, we're more likely to get positive outcomes as opposed to open source, which really has become a way of corporations talking about free software. And in fact, the term itself was created to appeal to executives at corporations who didn't understand the idea of free software, but could be persuaded to adopt free software based upon an argument that it was a better model for creating software. It has led to certain problems. So a lot of people today will be using free software, which they will call open source, and not actually have freedom in the use of that source code or in the use of that code. For instance, lots of people will have an Android phone, for instance, which will be locked by the carrier. So it means that you can't modify the software and run your modified version on the phone without coming afoul of terms of service according to the telecoms carrier. Now, that's a problem because that means you don't actually have freedom to be in control of your device.
It's not your phone.
That's right. So in some ways, open source gets us so far, but it doesn't teach us or doesn't communicate to our next door neighbour the importance of a social solidarity that we should have about the use of our technology in society, and doesn't get us to the point of freedom. So we always appeal to people to talk about free software rather than open source, so that you don't fall into a process of carrying forward the agenda, which is very much a corporate agenda, we think, of talking about software development models. What we want to reach for is the goal. What's the goal of open source? What's the goal of free software? And it's to have computer user freedom, so that we can, as we become more reliant on technology, we can be sure that technology will work on our behalf, not on the behalf of corporations, not on behalf of governments, but will be at our disposal and control.
Yeah, as Trump says, put the power to the users.
Yeah, it's great. In fact, I saw it's interesting the number of places you see the kind of arguments made for free software. There's a great one in Tron, and also in what's the other one? The Matrix has a very good metaphor for free software in there.
Yes.
About software being free. So it's interesting.
So one of the things I find very interesting, and I really like about the Free Software Foundation, and in fact Richard, is the really careful use of language. Richard, for people who may not have met him, is one of those people who I like to describe. He uses words like a scalpel, like a surgeon. Whenever he says something, it means exactly what he intends it to mean and nothing more, and he's extremely clear about that. So one of the more contentious things about the Free Software Foundation has been promoting is the desire to call what most people commonly call Linux the GNU Linux system. So can you explain to people a little bit why that's important? You feel that's important?
Sure. Well, in the same way that open source can lead to different outcomes. Open source will lead to devices which are TiVoized, which means that they're locked down and they're not in your control, but are seen as being open source. Those are not free software devices because we don't have freedom to be in control of them. Talking about Linux creates a different set of values, because the people who typically are involved with advancing the Linux project also focus on the issues of open source and development models. So there's also important message there about the reasons why that operating system was created. So the history is that Richard Stallman started the GNU project in 1983, and he created a number of the elements that make an operating system possible. The one element that was missing was the kernel, which is a piece of software which is at the center of an operating system and is part and parcel of interaction with the hardware that you're using. And our project for a free software kernel was called the Herd, and Linus Torvalds was able to write a kernel before Herd became available, and a combination of the GNU system, which had been being worked on already for 7 or 8 years by that time, and the kernel came together, and for the first time you could run a fully free operating system, a combination of the kernel Linux and the operating system GNU. It's not fair to call the operating system Linux when the initial project was called GNU, and that the addition of the kernel to the GNU system made an operating system possible. Again, the reason why Linux is the popular name for the distribution is because the very same corporations who wanted to adopt the term and promote the term open source also wanted to adopt the philosophies and the agenda of the people who were involved in the creation of the kernel. And so there was an opportunity to, as it were, separate out the development communities around GNU and the free software movement, and Linux and the open source group. So really, it's a separation around philosophy. And so if you support the idea of having computer user freedom, we want to appeal to you to use the term GNU Linux, so that people ask, well, what's GNU? And then you get the chance to talk to them about software freedom. As opposed to Linux, which when you talk about Linux, people say, oh, open source, and they talk about having access to the source code. They don't talk about freedom so much. So it's about how do we get people to care about the outcome? What's the end goal? The end goal is either a development model, if you follow open source and Linux, or it's computer user freedom, if you talk about GNU and free software. So that's why it's important.
So the thing I like to say is that you can actually enjoy the benefits of both.
Yes.
Because the development model is certainly very advantageous. I like to compare it to the difference between using the scientific method versus using alchemy, or having people tell you that they can do alchemy.
Yes.
Difference between chemistry and alchemy. But the freedom part of it I also find extraordinarily important, especially around issues of free hardware, and as you pointed out, well, you called it sort of TiVoization, which is probably a little unfair on the poor company TiVo. I think it's probably more accurate to call it digital, or rather, the official term is digital rights management, but I love the Free Software Foundation's digital restrictions management, because that much more accurately describes what it is that the hardware is doing to you. So I understand you have a new campaign around freedom and hardware and the equipment. So could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah. So we're at a position now, after 25 years, where we have a number of GNU Linux distributions which are fully free. And what this means is that they've gone through a process of looking at every part of their distribution, all the applications and also the kernel Linux, and making sure that all the non-free code has been removed, so that people who want to have computer user freedom can be sure of using an operating system that it does indeed deliver that. Now the problem with that, of course, is that there are still a number of pieces of hardware that require device drivers which are proprietary. And that means that certain hardware won't work with a kernel that is fully free. But we have now a kernel called Linux Libre, which is a version of the Linux kernel with all the proprietary elements removed. And that kernel has been adopted by, I think it's now 6 or 7 distributions of GNU Linux. And so what we would like to find is more hardware on which those fully free distributions of GNU Linux will work without tempting the user into using proprietary drivers. So to encourage that, we've launched a hardware endorsement program called Respect Your Freedom. And the idea is that hardware manufacturers will be able to have their products endorsed and carry a mark from the free software movement, which will help people buying hardware to identify a product which they know will work completely with free software. So it's a difficult thing to achieve, because there are so many restrictions. But this is a first step for that process of actually getting computers and general purpose devices which we will all be able to use, and which will, as we described the program, respect your freedom. But the good news is that we've already received a number of proposals from from corporations who believe that their devices are fully free, and we're actually looking at those now, reviewing those products now, and so hopefully shortly we'll be able to announce maybe not fully free computer systems, but some very important pieces of hardware that will work with free software. And one of the prospects we have is to be able to put together a parts list that anyone can then start to build a full system from, knowing that, oh, this wireless over here, produced by Atheros, that's fully free. Great, so we have wireless drivers over here, and hardware which is fully free. And over here we have, a graphics accelerator.
Right.
And so if we can identify and encourage equipment manufacturers to produce to that standard, then the hope of having a fully free system is realised.
That's actually very important. To show my age, I've been putting together my own computer systems for a long time. I guess most people just go to the store now. But you're right, one of the problems that you have when you're doing that is going into the store, finding a device and thinking, I really like that, but will it work? And sometimes the manufacturers helpfully include, sort of a little penguin logo on saying, this should work with GNU Linux, but then when you get it home, you find that there's some proprietary driver on a CD somewhere that's for a version of the kernel that's 5 years out of date.
Yeah.
So it's not exactly what you wanted in the first place. So that's very handy. Are you planning to maybe resell some of that hardware, or at least, or are you just going to endorse it as a?
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing one thing we know that people always have problems with when they want to run a distribution of free software that's fully free is wireless issues. That, they load up the
graphics.
Graphics. Well, graphics isn't. Yeah, I guess graphics is pretty bad. 3D acceleration is pretty terrible.
Games.
Yes, games.
Even though they're evil and proprietary, I love playing it. Well, most of them are, but yes, I love playing games.
It's a difficult area, games, but just to run a device, wireless is a big area. So so if we can certainly remove these barriers one at a time, then progress will be made, and it's being clear that a problem exists. That's the first thing. We have to be honest and say, whether it's people from the open source movement or people from the free software movement, we have to be honest and say, hold on, this isn't open source, or this isn't free software.
Yeah.
And by being clear that there's a problem, that's the first step to solving it. And there is certainly some fantastic work going on in the Linux kernel, real excellent efforts to clear up some of these problems.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about, even though there are philosophical differences between free software and open source, essentially we have the same goal in mind, which is to have fully open, free code available for all the devices and computer systems that we run.
Absolutely. In fact, it's really interesting when I speak to people who aren't too deeply involved in free software or open source and ask them what open source is about. A lot of people who use the term open source really care about freedom, and they mean freedom when they say open source. So one thing I always tease Simon Phipps about, who's involved in the open OSI? Open source?
Yes, the open source
OSI.
Initiative, yeah.
That really what we need is a rebranding of open source to make it also about freedom. And so, because we do have the same goals, people involved in both communities really do, at the end of the day, have the same goals. And what used to be a pragmatic thing to try and get executives to care about software freedom has really been achieved in many ways, because everyone's using free software now.
These days, it's hard to buy a television that doesn't have Linux in it, seriously.
Yeah, it's true.
Most of them are running free software internally to do the video processing.
Yeah. So. In fact, we've recently put a resource up on fsf.org where it's called Look Who's Using Free Software.
Yeah.
And we've got interviews with executives from CERN, where they're doing the Large Hadron Collider experiments. We've got interviews with policy directors at the US Defense Department. And there's a number of interviews with different very important organizations, all describing how they use free software for the most mission-critical parts of their operations. So from weapons systems to the New York Stock Exchange using GNU Linux for their trading platforms. So so really it's everywhere now, even at
Google itself.
Yeah, of course. Google.
Whenever you type anything into Google, you're using free software, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's everywhere doing everything, and so I think we don't need to be worried anymore about those executives not understanding the purpose of it. Now's the time to do the switch back on them and tell them, actually, you've just enabled freedom. Thank you.
Yeah, the freedom is important.
Yeah. So so if we can talk more about freedom, then I think we're more likely to achieve the final stages of what we want, which is free software everywhere and very little proprietary software.
Yeah. So I think I detect a non-Bostonian. The Free Software Foundation is based in Boston, Massachusetts, and I think I detect a non-Bostonian accent, unlike my native Californian accent. So, how did you come to the position you're in? I mean, what's your story?
I must say, I find your Californian accent really hard to understand.
Most people do. Yes.
Thanks to Google Translate, obviously, we can get past that.
Yeah.
So obviously, I'm from England. My hometown's Oxford in England, and I've been in Boston for 10 years, and with the Free Software Foundation now, just come up to my 10th anniversary at the Free Software Foundation as well.
So, I mean, what's your story? How did you move from Oxford to Boston and end up working for the Free Software Foundation with what is, to be honest, a really desirable job?
So 10 years ago, my wife's a scientist, and she was working at Oxford and working in the field of genetics. And at the time, there weren't too many places doing the kind of work she was doing. And out the blue, she got an offer to come and work at one of the Harvard research facilities. And so we were very happily living in the UK, in Oxford, and but we thought, oh, wow, get to go to America. Not every day you get that opportunity.
That's right.
So we thought we'd just pack our bags and come over and see what happened for a few years, and then always return. Myself, I'm actually an accountant by training, and so I've come from a background of finance and management, having worked for the likes of the BBC, British Telecom, and prior to joining the Free Software Foundation, I was working for a number of non-profits, and the one that most recently was an organisation called the New Internationalist, which is a very interesting organisation. They're basically a journalist organisation that write about world development issues, so about poverty, about human rights issues. And so I found that I was able to bring the skills of an accountant to bear for a positive outcome, working for an organisation that is trying to educate people and improve society's outlook on things like poverty and, say,
and free software is incredibly important for the developing world, of course, because
absolutely,
I mean, that's a way for a developing economy to completely bootstrap itself into the information age without paying hundreds of millions of dollars of licenses.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have considered myself someone who could have worked for a technology organisation if you'd asked me 10 years ago, because my background was really caring more about social issues.
Right.
But of course, as it turns out, the Free Software Foundation, in my opinion, is one of the most important social movements and successful social movements.
Yeah, it really is a social movement. Even though many of the people in it are antisocial.
Maybe because so many people are antisocial, that they're looking for an opportunity to improve their social network. So I think free software is a really important social movement, and certainly coming from a journalistic world that didn't really understand technology, I also thought there was an opportunity to help, take the message back to that world.
Yes.
To the world that cares about, the social agenda. How can technology play a part? How can that be part of a series of issues that people who care about advancing society can be aware of and start to take notice of? And so that's slowly happening.
And any non-profit that's spending money on proprietary software has more money than sense. And these days,
and so
there isn't enough money.
So many groups who have human rights and freedom of freedom of the press, at the heart of their agenda, don't realise that they're using tools that are really very dangerous for the future of society and for our freedom and for our ability to communicate in freedom.
Yeah.
And I guess we could say most recently we've been watching a very important issue around WikiLeaks happen. And so people should be aware that there are very very important issues, and the rub between ability to have freedom and the technology we use is people are becoming more aware of how closely connected they are.
Well, they use a. I mean, WikiLeaks uses a free software product, the Tor Onion router.
That's right.
In order for people to communicate
Anonymously,
securely,
yeah.
which is also used by many of the governments as well to communicate
Indeed,
safely
yeah.
and anonymously.
That's
So it's not a political tool; it's just an incredibly useful technical tool for achieving that kind of safety and security.
Yeah, and one thing we've discovered is everyone does care about freedom. Nobody doesn't care about freedom. So freedom is an issue that everyone across the board, no matter their political persuasion, agrees freedom is what we desire and what we want. And so really freedom and free software is one of those issues that we can all agree on to a certain extent. And certainly we hope that as we become more aware of free software and the importance of having control over the technology that we use, that free software will come to be seen as important infrastructure that we all depend upon.
So my quick pitch on that is that I always like to say that eventually your doorknob will have a computer in it, and who controls the code that runs on that will control the access to whatever door it is you're trying to go through.
Yeah, and the computer that your child is interacting with.
Yeah.
Who's on the other end of that?
Who controls what software is on it
and what they get to view. That's right. And so that's a really important issue. And obviously the next generation the coming generations are experiencing a much more pervasive use of technology, and so it's much more important that they have free software.
So I normally get to talk to programmers and technical people, and I always ask them how would you encourage people to get involved? For them, it's usually kind of, well, you start coding.
Yeah.
So it's really nice to talk to someone who didn't come through that career path. So how would you recommend that people who are interested in this subject, who would like to do more, who would like to help the community and the movement, how would you recommend that they get involved?
Yeah, I think there are so many opportunities. So often I hear from projects who need help with graphics, or they need artistic work, or they need help in their writing, or documentation. So there's opportunities in technical writing, there's opportunities in blogging. Many of the people in the free software community care...
Marketing and promotion.
Yes, marketing and promotion. So caring about the ideals of free software. So for instance, if you think about any free software project, there's always, most free software projects have a proprietary version alternative. And so talking to people about why they should use free software has a real opportunity there to talk about those social aspects of the use of free software and to promote the use of free software, not just based upon its utility, but based upon its ability to have the benefit for society. So as I say, so many non-profits and organisations that have high up on their agenda concern about society, there's a real opportunity to reach out to them, and members of those communities have a real potential to impact society going forward by getting free software adopted into their organisation. So if you work at an organisation that isn't using much free software, there's a really great opportunity to work with free software projects and to make their use in your organisation more prevalent. So I think there's lots of opportunity, and there's certainly more opportunity than there used to be, because more people are now using free software and can see the benefits of it. So I would encourage anyone who cares about the future and use of technology to reach out to a project they care about and to offer to help them with their campaigning and marketing.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice. Thank you so much for talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for talking to me.
Thanks a lot.